Julia Roberts finally reveals why she never mentions Eric Roberts, and the truth cuts far deeper than sibling rivalry or Hollywood gossip. One became America's sweetheart, a face synonymous with warmth and openness. The other was already inside the industry, carving his own path, long before her name lit up marquees. Yet as Julia's career exploded, one thing remained strikingly absent: her brother's name. For years, fans noticed the silence. Interviews came and went. Careers were discussed. Family was mentioned, but Eric was not. While he spoke openly, sometimes painfully, Julia chose restraint, drawing a boundary few ever questioned directly. The distance felt intentional, yet unexplained, leaving a quiet tension hanging in the background of her public life. Only now, with time offering clarity rather than emotion, does the reason behind that silence begin to surface. And it raises a question that reshapes everything. Was Julia's silence not rejection, but protection? Before Hollywood decided who would be visible and who would be questioned, Julia Roberts and Eric Roberts were simply siblings growing up inside the same creative orbit. Acting was not an abstract dream in their household. It was familiar, discussed, and encouraged. Performance existed as something attainable, shaped by effort rather than fantasy. In those early years, there was no hierarchy, no narrative of success or failure. There was only proximity and shared ambition. Eric, the older sibling, stepped into that world first. He pursued acting with intensity, learning the industry from the inside out. Rejection, persistence, and gradual recognition defined his early path. Long before Julia's name meant anything to casting directors or audiences, Eric was already working, already visible, already absorbing the realities of a profession that rarely offers guarantees. His breakthrough came through determination, not timing, and it placed him firmly within Hollywood's awareness. Julia watched from nearby, not as an observer removed from the process, but as someone learning what the pursuit demanded. She saw the effort behind the roles, the unpredictability behind opportunity. When she began acting herself, she did not arrive as a stranger to the industry. She arrived informed. Eric's presence mattered in those early moments, not as leverage, but as familiarity. Doors are easier to open when someone has already walked the hallway. At this stage, their relationship was not defined by comparison. It was shaped by shared experience. They moved through auditions, conversations, and early work without the weight of public expectation. The future had not yet assigned meaning to their last name. Fame had not yet distorted perspective. What existed between them was ordinary, grounded, and intact. This period is often overlooked because it lacks drama. There were no headlines, no speculation, no imbalance to analyze. Yet it matters because it establishes the truth that came before everything else. Julia and Eric did not begin as symbols of contrast. They began as family navigating the same uncertain terrain. The difference came later, when visibility arrived unevenly and the world began telling their story for them. But before that shift, there was no silence to interpret. There was no absence to question. Their bond existed without needing explanation, unburdened by expectation or judgment. Understanding this beginning reframes everything that follows, and reminds us that what later appeared as distance did not emerge from indifference. It grew out of change. The sibling relationship was formed long before the spotlight altered how each of them could safely exist within it. When fame eventually entered their lives, it did not build on emptiness. It disrupted something already present. The quiet familiarity they shared would later be tested by attention neither could fully control. But at the start, before success assigned roles and audiences chose sides, Julia and Eric Roberts stood on equal ground, unaware that one name would soon become everywhere, and the other would be forced to navigate what that imbalance would demand. This is the foundation the public rarely sees. Two siblings, shaped by the same environment, stepping toward the same craft, unaware that visibility would one day change not just their careers, but the safest way to acknowledge each other at all. Fame did not enter the lives of Julia Roberts and Eric Roberts at the same pace, and that difference changed everything. Eric's career continued to build through steady work and recognition earned role by role. He was respected within the industry, known for commitment and range, and his presence remained consistent. Success for him was gradual, shaped by persistence rather than explosion. Julia's ascent followed a different path. When her career took off in the late 1980s, it did so with remarkable speed. One role led to another, and suddenly her face was everywhere. Audiences embraced her warmth and accessibility, critics praised her emotional range, and Hollywood placed her at the center of its attention. Fame did not knock quietly. It arrived fully formed, bringing with it scrutiny that extended far beyond her work. This imbalance was not created by choice. It was the nature of how visibility operates. Julia's success reshaped how the world viewed the Roberts name. What had once been a shared identity became a public contrast. One sibling became a symbol of cinematic optimism. The other continued working, yet now in the shadow of a comparison he did not ask for. Public narratives began to form. Media outlets framed their careers side by side, often reducing complexity into simple storylines. These comparisons ignored reality. They overlooked the fact that success in Hollywood rarely follows the same pattern twice. Yet once the narrative took hold, it became difficult to escape. Every mention of one invited reference to the other. Words spoken publicly carried new weight. Eric, speaking openly about his career and family, made comments about Julia's rise that later required apology. Those remarks, once printed and replayed, gained a permanence that personal conversations never do. Context dissolved, meaning shifted. What remained were fragments interpreted by an audience far removed from the relationship itself. Julia did not respond publicly. Her silence was immediate and consistent. As attention intensified, she chose restraint. Interviews focused on work. Personal history narrowed. The choice was not defensive, it was protective. Visibility had already shown its cost. Speaking would have expanded the narrative rather than correcting it. As Julia's fame solidified, so did the imbalance. Her life became subject to constant observation, while Eric's remained more exposed through openness rather than spotlight. The difference shaped how each could move safely through the world. For Julia, every word carried consequence. For Eric, words were part of processing and survival. This period marked a turning point. Fame did not just change careers. It altered the conditions under which family could exist publicly. What had once been shared became separate. What had been familiar became interpreted. The siblings were no longer navigating the same environment, even though they worked in the same industry. The emotional cost of this shift is often misunderstood. Distance was not chosen lightly. It formed as a response to imbalance. Fame, once introduced, demands adaptation. For Julia, that adaptation meant narrowing access to her private life. For Eric, it meant living with a public narrative he did not fully control. By the end of this phase, the dynamic between them had changed. The equality of the early years gave way to asymmetry. One name became ubiquitous. The other became subject to comparison rather than context. And from that moment on, every choice Julia made about what to say or not say carried a weight shaped by the uneven arrival of fame. As Julia Roberts' career reached its height, her public image became inseparable from the idea of warmth. She was celebrated as America's sweetheart, a presence audiences trusted, admired, and felt they knew. Her interviews were open without being revealing, personal without being exposed. She laughed easily, spoke thoughtfully, and carried a sense of accessibility that made fame feel gentle rather than distant. Yet within that carefully balanced visibility, one absence grew increasingly noticeable. Eric Roberts' name was rarely spoken by Julia in public. Not in profiles, not on red carpets, not in reflective interviews about family or upbringing. The omission stood out precisely because Julia appeared so open in every other way. Fans noticed, media noticed. Questions lingered without answers. The silence became part of her public narrative, even though she never addressed it directly. This contrast created quiet tension. Julia's persona suggested emotional transparency, yet her restraint around family told a different story. It revealed the line she refused to cross. The more beloved she became, the more deliberate her boundaries grew. Fame had already demonstrated its appetite. It consumed personal detail, reshaped intention, and often reduced complexity into digestible speculation. Julia chose not to offer her family to that process. Meanwhile, Eric continued to exist publicly in his own way. He worked steadily and spoke candidly about his life, including struggles and recovery. His openness contrasted with Julia's silence, feeding a narrative that felt one-sided. Audiences heard from him, but not from her. In that imbalance, assumptions flourished. Yet the absence of Julia's voice was not dismissal, it was consistency. Over years, her silence never wavered. She did not selectively mention Eric. She did not address rumors. She did not correct narratives. The lack of engagement was itself a message, one shaped by experience rather than indifference. This period revealed the emotional cost of being endlessly visible. Julia's fame demanded a version of herself that remained stable, uncontroversial, and intact. Family conflict, even when rooted in complexity rather than drama, threatened that stability. Speaking would have invited interpretation that neither sibling controlled. Silence limited the story's reach. The longer the omission lasted, the heavier it became. Fans began to read intention into it. Some interpreted it as rejection, others as punishment. Few considered protection. Yet protection often looks cold from the outside. It requires withholding, even when misunderstanding follows. Julia's choice to keep Eric out of her public narrative was not about rewriting history. It was about preserving something fragile. Family bonds strained by fame cannot always withstand exposure. Privacy became a way to prevent further damage, even if it meant accepting judgment. This absence also shaped Eric's public identity. His words carried the weight of being the only voice heard. When he later acknowledged boundaries around speaking about his sister, it revealed an agreement that had likely existed for years. Silence was not imposed, it was respected. In this stage of their story, the missing name became the story itself. Not because it hid a secret, but because it marked a line Julia would not cross. America's sweetheart remained generous with audiences, but guarded with what mattered most. And in that restraint, the truth waited, not for attention, but for the right moment to be understood. The reason Julia Roberts never mentions Eric Roberts publicly is not rooted in anger or erasure, it is rooted in experience. Over time, silence became the only option that protected what remained of a complicated bond shaped by fame, imbalance, and exposure. This truth did not arrive as a sudden confession. It emerged gradually, through choices repeated so consistently that they became a statement on their own. Eric Roberts has spoken openly about his struggles, including addiction and the impact it had on his personal and professional life. These were not private matters once they entered interviews and memoirs. They became part of the public record, discussed, analyzed, and often misunderstood. Julia lived in a different reality. Her life unfolded under a microscope that magnified every word, every pause, every omission. In that environment, speaking about family carried consequences far beyond intention. There was also history. Eric once made public comments suggesting responsibility for Julia's early success, remarks he later apologized for. The apology mattered, but the moment revealed how easily family dynamics could be reshaped once spoken aloud. Words intended for context became sound bites. Personal history became public property. Julia learned, through observation, that silence prevented further distortion. Their relationship experienced distance, including a period of estrangement that lasted until around 2004. When reconnection happened, it did so quietly. There were no statements, no photographs offered as proof. Repair took place privately, where nuance could survive. That choice reflected a shared understanding that public reconciliation often serves audiences more than the people involved. Eric later acknowledged that he was not supposed to speak publicly about his sister. That admission did not suggest control. It suggested agreement. Boundaries had been set, and they were respected. For Julia, those boundaries were not about punishment. They were about preservation. Family once consumed by public appetite is difficult to reclaim. Julia's silence did not mean absence of feeling. It meant prioritizing stability over explanation. Speaking would have reopened narratives already proven harmful. Silence limited the reach of speculation, even if it could not stop it entirely. She accepted misunderstanding as the cost of protection. This choice also aligned with how Julia approached fame overall. She offered warmth, humor, and accessibility through her work, while keeping personal complexity contained. Her generosity toward audiences never extended to sacrificing family privacy. The line remained firm. The truth behind the silence is not dramatic. It is restrained. Julia did not need to explain why she never mentioned Eric. Her actions did the explaining. She chose not to expose family complexity to a public culture that thrives on fracture. She chose not to let old wounds become ongoing commentary. She chose quiet continuity over public clarity. In the end, silence became an act of care, not the absence of love, but its guarded form. Julia Roberts did not stop mentioning her brother because he no longer mattered. She stopped because he mattered enough to protect from a world that had already shown what it would do with their story if given the chance. Over time, Julia Roberts' silence did something unexpected. It did not erase her brother from the story. It reframed the story entirely. What many assumed was distance revealed itself as intention, a decision shaped not by fear of the past, but by care for what could still survive. Silence became the boundary that allowed something fragile to remain intact. Julia's career continued to evolve, yet her approach to fame remained consistent. She stayed visible without becoming exposed. She shared warmth without offering access. That balance did not happen by accident. It was learned. Family once pulled into public interpretation rarely escapes unchanged. By keeping Eric out of her public narrative, Julia prevented their relationship from being continually reinterpreted, relabeled, and reshaped by voices that did not live inside it. Eric, too, grew with time. He continued working, continued speaking honestly about his life, and continued acknowledging past mistakes. His openness did not conflict with Julia's restraint. It existed alongside it. Two different coping strategies emerged from the same experience. One chose distance from public discussion. The other chose truth spoken aloud. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply responses to different pressures. What was preserved through Julia's silence was dignity. Not just her own, but Eric's as well. Public discussion would have reduced complexity into sides, judgments, and simplified conclusions. Silence allowed nuance to remain where it belonged, off camera and out of reach. It protected moments of private repair that never needed validation. This choice also preserved the possibility of relationship without performance. Reconnection did not require proof. Understanding did not need witnesses. In refusing to narrate family history, Julia left room for growth that did not depend on approval. Silence became space. For fans, this reframing alters how the story is understood. What once appeared as absence now reads as boundary. What felt like avoidance becomes restraint. The emotional truth is quieter than gossip allows. Some relationships endure not because they are spoken about, but because they are kept away from consumption. Julia never offered a single moment of explanation. She did not give an interview that clarified everything. Instead, she lived the answer over decades. Her silence was consistent, unwavering, and intentional. that consistency is its own form of truth. In the end, what Julia Roberts preserved was not an image, but a relationship's right to exist without interpretation. She chose not to let family become content. She chose not to let pain become narrative. And in doing so, she showed that sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is refuse to explain what the world is not entitled to understand. Julia Roberts never stood before a microphone and explained her silence about Eric Roberts. She did something far more deliberate. She lived it. Over time, her restraint revealed a truth shaped by experience rather than impulse, that not every relationship survives exposure, and not every bond benefits from explanation. In a world that demands access, she chose boundaries. In an industry that feeds on personal fracture, she chose containment. Eric's story continued publicly. Julia's unfolded carefully. Two siblings responded differently to the same pressure, each finding a way to endure. What looked like distance was often protection. What felt like absence was intention. The truth was never hidden, it was guarded. This story is not about blame or resolution. It is about survival inside fame. About understanding when silence preserves more than words ever could. Julia did not stop mentioning her brother because he no longer mattered. She stopped because he mattered too much to turn into narrative. For more emotional stories, check out this video.